Hey there, hello, Sindre here, and I am still an associate professor. When I'm not researching, I predominantly do two things. First of all, I am teaching project management, and second of all, I am supervising master students writing their master thesis. And I noticed there are certain mistakes and errors that master thesis students tend to do while writing their thesis. And many of these mistakes could have been avoided if the students were just applying what they were learning in their project management courses. So in this video, I thought I would talk about the mistakes that can be traced back to what they call the project lifecycle model. So a very basic concept within project management, that's a project lifecycle model, which essentially, well, it just states that a project goes through like a life cycle. Kind of like us humans, first we are babies, then we are toddlers, and then we are children, then teenagers, and then adults, and then we are decommissioned at the end. And projects are the same. So the curriculum book that I use in my course, Gardener 2005, has a very basic life cycle model consisting of 4 different phases. Phase number 1 is initiation and definition. Phase number 2 is planning, and phase number 3 is execution and control, and finally phase number 4 is closure. So that's the basic of the project life cycle model. So what are the mistakes that students do when it comes to this very simple model? Well, there are 3 things in particular that I notice. So students know that their thesis is worth 30 ECTS. And the students also know that one ECTS has a workload of 30 hours. So 30 times 30 is 900. So therefore, many students believe that the entire project and entire master thesis is 900 hours of work. But that isn't quite true. It's not really the case. I know I feel like a broken record because I keep mentioning that everything requires more work than you think. But it kind of is the case here. 900 hours doesn't refer to like the whole project. 900 hours is actually only about the time you're supposed to spend in your final semester. But a student is supposed to have already done some of the work by the time they start their final semester. So actually, what the students is predominantly supposed to do in the 4th and final phase, what they're supposed to spend 900 hours on, is predominantly just the 3rd phase, execution and control. So they kind of mix together. They think 900 hours is the whole project, but actually it's mostly just a description of the time required to do the 3rd phase there out of the 4 phases. So because of this, doing a master thesis is going to end up taking more time than you might think initially. So the 900 hour statistics workload is kind of misleading in that sense. So by the time you start your final semester, you're kind of supposed to have already done initiation, definition, and the planning phase. So another mistake that students tend to do when it comes to the project lifecycle model is that they kind of just skip altogether the first phase, initiation and definition. Now for the uninitiated, initiation definition, that's a phase where you do a process called scoping. And scoping is a process where you're trying to establish what the project requirements are. Project requirements is mostly 3 things. It's a description of the business needs, like why are you doing this project, what's the purpose of it, what caused you to do this project. And second is a description of the deliverables. And deliverables is all of the outputs generated by the project. The product and services that you create in order to satisfy the business needs. And finally is a description, the project requirements is a description of the work that you need to do to bring about the project deliverables. So initiation definition is about scoping, and scoping is about establishing the project requirements, and project requirements is a description of the work you need to do in order to create deliverables in order to satisfy the business needs. So that's basically what you do, initiation and definition. So part of that is to do what we call a feasibility study and a business case. Feasibility study is about establishing whether or not it's possible to do the project that you are proposing, and if it is, then you move on to make a business case, which is about determining conditional to being possible to the project. Would you actually want to do it? Is this beneficial to do the project? So that is kind of what we do in the first phase there of Gardner's 4-phase project lifecycle model. And students tend to just skip that altogether. And that can lead to some disastrous results because consequently, if you skip this phase, you can end up trying to do a project that is just not feasible. And that happens a lot more often than you might think. So specifically, what often happens is that students are trying to do a thesis where the data required doesn't really exist. So students will spend a lot of time on writing the introduction, the theory chapter, the methodology, the literature review, and when they have 1 or 2 months left before the deadline, then they try to find the data so they can write the result and conclusion. And then I just realized, oh no, the data does not exist. It's not possible to actually finish this master thesis. And that could have been avoided if you just did feasibility study, which is part of the initiation and definition phase. So that's kind of the second mistake that students tend to do. They're skipping the first phase. And the first phase can potentially be a lot more time consuming than 900 hours. So 900 hours is about doing execution and control, but how much time are you supposed to do in doing initiation, definition, and planning? That kind of varies tremendously from student to student. In best case scenario, a professor or a company will already have like a research question ready for you, and therefore you don't really need to put that much effort into the first 2 phases. It's kind of already done for you by someone else. But for most students, they have to come up with these sort of things themselves, and that could potentially, as I said, be a lot more time consuming than 900 hours. When it comes to the PhD students, we see quite often that they can spend like a year, maybe more, on trying to figure out what they want to write about, and then they write the article, paper in just a couple of months. So initiation, definition, far more time consuming than everything else when it comes to kind of academic research, because you kind of need to find a topic and a research question that is smart, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound. And that means finding a research question which allows you to do research as a novelty and utility. And that is possible to do. And that is quite difficult. You can spend a lot of time trying to come up with a good research question, and then not so much time actually solving the research question. So that's the second mistake. The third mistake that I see students tend to do is they are using the wrong project lifecycle model. And when it comes to my students specifically, I feel that's kind of my fault, because I only teach them the Gardner lifecycle model, which is like a linear lifecycle model. You do phase 1, then you do phase 2, then you do phase 3, then you do phase 4, and then you are done. That isn't really the case when it comes to doing academic research, because you're dealing with a type of project where both the solution and the goal is unclear. You're not dealing with traditional project management, you're dealing with your extreme project management with an unclear goal, with an unclear method, and consequently, you should not be using a linear project lifecycle model. You should be using a non-linear. A lifecycle model is feedback loops. So, for instance, if you're doing empirical research, if you're doing regression analysis or econometrics, for instance, you will be using a lifecycle model that looks more like this. As you can see here, this is based on Brooks 2008, by the way, which I adapted slightly. As you can see here, there are many feedback loops, not a straight line. You don't go from A, B, C, D. You go to A to B, and then you might loop back to A. If you manage to do B, you go to C, and you might loop back to B or A again. So there's many feedback loops. And what is the consequence of this? I like to kind of compare this to the Snakes and Ladder board game. So imagine that you are playing a board game here. You need to move through 100 spaces by throwing a die. So if you die, say 3, then you move 3 spaces. And if there are 100 spaces, how long does it take for you to get to the end? Well, on average, that would be like 100 spaces divided by 3.5, right? That is what students believe erroneously that they are dealing with. Again, where you don't have any snakes and ladders. But in reality, they're dealing with a snakes and ladder board game where you don't have any ladders nor shortcuts, but you have a lot of snakes. So instead of you're basically comparing these two games. So in the first game, it would on average take you 28.5 rounds to finish. But for this particular version of Snakes and Ladder board game, it would take a lot longer. In this particular case, it takes 61 rounds to finish. So that is like twice as long. And also, if you do Monte Carlo simulation here, you will see that the maximum time that it takes to do the project in these two games increases from your 41 to 391. So you multiply by 10 almost. So, long story short, you should be dealing with you're dealing with a non-linear project lifecycle model, but many students are assuming dealing with a linear project lifecycle model, and the consequence of that is that the project takes a lot longer time than you might think. So that's the 3 mistakes that students tend to do when it comes to the project lifecycle model. Number 1, they erroneously believe that 900 hours is a description of the whole project. No, it's more a description of the third phase, execution and control. Second mistake, students tend to skip the first phase, initiation definition. And the final mistake is that students tend to believe they're dealing with a linear rather than a non-linear project lifecycle model. And the consequence here is that it's going to take a lot longer time than you might think. So yeah, good luck with your master thesis.